Welcome to the Fax Machine! We're so excited to bring you our third episode, which is arriving after an admittedly lengthy hiatus, though if the saying about absence making the heart grow fonder is true, you guys are gonna love it. I'm here with Noah and Rob, and we're going to share with each other and with you some cool facts that we've gathered around this episode's theme, what's in a name? Specifically, what's in our names? Basically, each of our stories have a connection to our names, so you're going to hear about various sorts of Rob's, Noah's, and Emily's that are likely more interesting but optimistically less attractive than the ones doing the storytelling.
And before we jump in, I'll just plug our social media. We are Fax Machine Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and Fax Machine Podcast on Facebook. Check us out.
Thanks, Rob. The format of this episode will be the same as our previous, with an exchange of 3 facts followed by a pub-style trivia quiz, loosely inspired by the theme. And with that, we'll get started with our first fact from Rob. Take it away.
So this week I learned that as of the last U.S. Census, there were 11,518 U.S. citizens who shared a name with one Confederate general.
Who is it?
It is Robert E. Lee.
Oh,
come on
named
down.
after Rob.
Yes,
I
that's
see.
right.
There we go.
That's my name. Yeah, it is not Jefferson Davis. There are 65 Jefferson Davises, according to the U.S. Census. It is not Stonewall Jackson. There are, in fact, 4 Stonewall Jacksons walking around the United States right now.
I hope they're all
Part of the
goalies.
country?
Alaska. They're all in Alaska. No.
I'm sure that information is available.
I probably could have. There's actually, so I'll tell you how I know this. There's a website that's called howmanyofme.com. It's an interesting resource because it looks through the previous census data, and you can search by first name, last name, or both. And you can even search by state and figure out like how many of me live in my district, in my state. But it lets you also conduct some really interesting searches. So I was able to look up a few really common names, including those other Confederate generals. As of today, there are no Adolf Hitlers in the United States.
We did it!
Yeah. After much travail. Not a single one left. But there are, according to this, up to 121 people who have the surname Hitler in the United States. Which I think is a fairly tough lot in life.
Yeah.
But following along that line, we're pretty good at not having fascist dictators. There are no Joseph Stalins in the United States. Conversely, there are also no Winston Churchills in the United States. But at current times, there are 12 Manuel Noriegas running around the United States. And I think this was really interesting. There's not a single Franklin Roosevelt left in the United States, but there are 12 Roosevelt Franklins.
Wow. That's really interesting.
There are 461 George Bushes out there in the United States right now, only 2 of which have been president.
No.
So,
All right. Yeah, this time.
when you do the math,
That's not a terrible ratio.
no, 1 in 200. There's a 1 in 200 chance that George Bush, was president. That's pretty. You can't say that about any of your other friends, I think.
That's true.
There's only one LeBron James, as we all know.
Is he the Ohio lander?
There can only be one. Isn't he though?
All right, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's the one and only LeBron James, but at this time there are around 160 James LeBrons in the United States, who benefit from the jerseys tremendously.
Yeah, totally.
According to my research, there are in the order of 20 or so Emily Costas in the United States.
So that's why I can't get a Gmail.
Yeah. Emily Costa 27. But you may be happy to find out there are no Noah Giversons.
You're like LeBron.
Like, actually...
I try to keep a low profile.
So if that was redacted when this comes out, folks, that's why. But unlike you, Noah, and I suppose Hitler, there are many Robert Lees out there. There are no other parallels I like to draw.
Oh my god.
Or we could say, unlike you, Noah, and Franklin Roosevelt,
Okay, thank you.
there are many Robert Lees out there, and that's because of many factors. One, Robert is currently the third most popular first name in the United States. Lee is one of the most popular last names. The reason Lee is such a popular last name is actually interesting. It draws from many different ethnic and racial groups. So the breakdown, the demographics are Lees in the United States are about 40% Caucasians, 40% Asian mainlanders, 15% Pacific Islanders, and about 5% other. So it draws from populations all around the world who have a last name Lee. And so there are 11,000 Robert Lees running around. Some of which are named kind of in honor of Robert E. Lee, some of which completely unaware that there was a Confederate general named Robert E. Lee. And this
The
was
state of our education system.
it speaks to a much bigger problem.
Let me tell you, in Texas, growing up in the, going to public high school in Texas, that was not a problem we had, was not knowing about Confederate generals. And I'm pretty sure I'm worse off for it, but...
There's a great article in The Atlantic that was spurred on some public events a few years ago that asked the question, what is it like being named Robert Lee in the modern United States? And it detailed a few individuals. It was a far from exhaustive survey of Robert Lees, but it tells kind of anecdotal stories of Robert Lees in Starbucks or going to college and having people ask, hey, what's your middle initial? And then be like, who are you? Why do you care?
None of your business.
That raises a good point, though, because if you were a Robert Lee who had a middle initial, why wouldn't you just go by your middle name?
It's true.
Like, I mean, maybe that wouldn't occur to some people, but I'm just saying, like, you could do that.
That's a
like
good
if you were
cop-out,
Robert
yeah.
Eric Lee, I think you'd probably be better off just going by Eric Lee.
Yeah.
But so even historians say the reason that we know him as Robert E. Lee is because 150 years ago, there's still a lot of Robert Lees. It was like super confusing. Even at West Point, there were probably several Robert Lees in like any cadet class.
Oh, do you think that, Rob? Because I happen to have actually looked up every class here at West Point, found Robert E. Lees, and I can tell you that there are no Robert E. Lees in his class, but there is a Catherinus Putnam Buckingham, an Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, a Lancaster P. Lupton, and consistent listeners to our podcast will enjoy Thomas S. Words. or Swords. Not Thomas Shit.
Oh, Thomas
His name
Swords.
is Thomas
Sorry.
S. Words. Okay?
All right.
And also, really interestingly, a John F. Kennedy, who it is listed on this website, died of disease.
So for you conspiracy theorists, that's what happened to John F. Kennedy.
he died of disease.
Actually, to expand upon that even further, I too looked up Robert E. Lee's class roster
Really?
at West
Wow.
Point. It seemed relevant. And actually, in my case, honed in on another classmate of his named Charles Mason. So Charles Mason and Robert E. Lee had a pretty historically documented rivalry at West Point. In the most obvious way, Charles Mason was from New York, and of course Robert E. Lee was from Virginia, so that kind of recapitulated the northern-southern rivalry that was already happening at the time, as we just discussed. But in addition, the two graduated neck and neck, with Mason actually beating out Robert E. Lee as top of their class by a fairly narrow margin. So to clarify just how narrow this actually is, Charles Mason graduated with an overall score of 1,995.5 points out of a possible total 2,000 points, compared to Robert E. Lee's 1,966.5. So I will say that Mason and Lee were tied for some very important courses, including artillery, tactics, and conduct. But overall, Mason scored better in multiple courses, with the exception, and I will say to me this is quite vindicating, of French, in which Charles Mason lost 4.5 marks. But you know what? It's totally fine. It's not a problem. I will say, to me, the most impressive thing about this is that Charles Mason and Robert E. Lee, to this day, still have the 2 highest graduation point scores that were ever attained at West Point. And also interesting to mention, the 3rd highest score after them was earned by Douglas MacArthur, whom you guys may have also heard of.
And all I have left because I said Lee is a very common last name, I actually looked up some of the most common last names in the United States, and I was actually able to break it down by state. And I think there's kind of this trope we're all familiar with, that Smith is like the most common last name. And it pretty much, it bears out. It really, really is. And in fact, if you look, there are only 5 states in the United States where Smith is not one of the 3 most popular names. So, state number 1. The first state does not have Smith as one of the top 3 last names because of the presence of so many Nordic names.
Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Yes.
Very nice.
Whoa, that was
Team
quick.
effort.
Oh yeah.
Now,
totally.
in a similar way, this state also is very heavily influenced by Nordic last names, although one of its major cities was named after a Prussian.
Oh, it's North Dakota. Bismarck.
Sure.
There
Oh,
it is.
of course.
Yep.
There we go. Nice.
You
All
can
right.
answer the next one.
it's
fine.
I'm quite weak in geography, so feel free to take the reins.
All right. This next state has names that do not hearken from Europe. They hearken from another area in the world. That's top 3 names. And it is famous in the last few years for having notoriously high gas emission standards that have kind of throttled the entire U.S. gas emissions, including the Obama-era gas emissions on cars and vehicles. So this is a state that is extremely progressive on automaker.
California?
That's California.
Woo!
Very nice.
Nice. Well done.
All right. The 3 names there, Garcia, Hernandez, and Lopez, the top 3 names in California.
What about Texas? What are the top-
Smith is in there, but it's
Smith?
between Garcia and Martinez.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Pertinent to that information, that will help you with this next state. This next state that does not contain Smith in the top 3 names is one of 4 states in the United States that begins with the same word.
This would be new,
So
right?
new. I suppose so. New Mexico?
Yeah.
That's the one.
Nice.
Martinez, Garcia, and Chavez, your top 3. All right. And this 5th state, interestingly, it has an influence of last names from an entirely different part of the world.
It's gotta be Hawaii.
That it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Just inflection alone carried
Yeah.
that clue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're Lee, Wong, and Kim, the 3
Nice.
most popular last names in
That's
Hawaii.
All right, so thanks very much, Rob. Noah, what have you got for us?
All right. Thanks, Emily. This week I learned that according to the Bible, Noah invented wine and was the first person to have ever been drunk. And not just drunk, like really sloppy drunk. There are in fact whole discourses from theologians throughout history debating whether his drunkenness was a sin since he had no idea what would happen.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's
For
fair.
example, a 4th century archbishop of Constantinople excused Noah's behavior as defensible because as the first human to taste wine, he would not have known its effects. And he wrote, "Through ignorance and inexperience of the proper amount to drink, he fell into a drunken stupor." Okay, so I'm going to tell the story of Noah and how he got drunk for the first time in human history, allegedly. And so let's set the scene. In Genesis, God says, quote, "I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made him." Okay? This is a really dark story if you think about it. And as a kid, being read these stories or seeing them in like coloring books, I was apparently totally cool with the idea that all of humanity was bad. So now obviously everyone had to go except for this one guy and his family. Apparently I was distracted by the rainbows. Like I don't know what happened.
But think of how good Noah had to be. Like
Yeah,
that's
he was like so
Yeah.
good.
how good is this
Solid
guy?
But most people know what happens next. I mean, God washes everything away with a big old flood and starts over, but he thinks Noah's pretty cool, so he spares him and his family and then tells them to save all the animals. So this is how it goes in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 19 through 22, "And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive." Noah did this. Then
Can we
Yeah.
clarify why there's a separate category for creeping things? Like, what
Okay.
exactly does that entail?
it's a good point.
It's like, walking and like that other kind of walking that's
Walk,
gross.
something swim, and then something's just creep.
Also, like, I've always had this issue is that they're on a boat for 40 days. You bring 2 lions and 2 zebras, and you think you're gonna leave the boat with 2 zebras? Like, whose idea was that?
Yeah.
Well,
Who
it's
didn't know the
interesting you say
riddle
that.
with the lions?
It's interesting that you say that because clearly, I mean, he just said, of all the birds, bring 2 kinds, male and female. Okay? Of all the creeping things, which I'm pretty sure just means things that walk. I don't know. That is a weird phrasing.
Insects?
Things that walk on the ground. And insects. Probably that was their way of saying everything. Anything that moves along the ground.
Arthropods
2.
are a huge part of the biomass of
You're
Earth.
so right. You're so right. Okay.
By Jove, I think we've got it.
But let's not distract from the story of the Bible by doing things that are actually relevant to real life. But they very clearly are saying 2 of every kind, and that's the story that people remember. All right? But then, like, 3 sentences later, then God says, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. Don't know what that means. The male and its mate. And 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. Okay? So, right after he says, get 2 of all the things, okay? That's pretty straightforward. You can do that male and female mating pairs. That's pretty clear. You can imagine that Noah went off and he was searching for all the things. He got all the animals. He dug into little burrows to get the animals underground. He chased down all the really fast animals. He just picked up the arthropods. They were easy. He probably invented some early version of like a flying machine so he could go capture all of the birds, okay? However, he gets done with this. It probably took him years, okay? It's not specified, right? And then God says, take with you 7 pairs of all the animals that you got, not just 1 pair, all right? And he gave him 7 days. So the flood finally comes, and then after a few months, it ends up subsiding, and everybody's pretty stoked. And so in addition to a bunch of sacrifices, Noah plants a vineyard and then drinks some of the wine that comes out of that vineyard, okay? So then it says in Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. All right, here's where it gets super weird.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Bracing ourselves.
Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. In the next verse, Genesis chapter 9, verse 22 and 23, it says, and Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So,
It's respectable. Okay.
yeah. So basically what just happened was his son Ham went in, saw that his father was really naked and just drunk and passed out, went back out and told other people. So the next chapters of Genesis are known as the Curse of Ham. And when I first saw that term, the Curse of Ham, I wrote in my notes, this sounds funny, look it up later. Okay? Turns out it's not funny at all. It is in fact super gross and depressing. Okay?
That's why it's not on Denny's menus.
Exactly. So, in the next couple verses, it says, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Ham is cursed. Lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and then he died.
Oh.
You can't complain.
Okay. It's not a bad... Well, actually, no. He lived a total of 950 years after the flood. He was quite old at the time of the flood. According to the Bible, Noah is the first to drink wine and the first to discover its intoxicating properties. After reading this, I set out to find whether this is historically accurate, whether this ancient story passed down over thousands and thousands of years may give us some sense of the time in which our ancestors discovered for the first time what K.A. Matthews called a, quote, pleasant relief for man from the toilsome work of the crop. And according to archaeologists, it turns out it's not even close. But let's break it down. Okay, so estimates of biblical chronology place the Great Flood around 2500 BCE. But it turns out that there are numerous archaeological sites in Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, Turkey, and the Caucasus from around that time and from much, much earlier where they found evidence of alcoholic beverages. But the oldest of all comes from Jiahu, China. Dated as far back as 7000 BCE, over 9,000 years ago. It is about as far away, 4,500 years from the supposed time of the story of Noah, as we are to the story of Noah now.
Wow.
Okay?
Holy cow.
So what kind of alcohol was this, you ask? Apparently,
know?
it was a mix of a lot of things. It was made of rice, grapes, hawthorn berries, and honey. It had the properties of a beer and of a wine. It was probably very chunky. It likely necessitated the use of a straw, as did many ancient beverages. This and other ancient alcohols at many other sites were discovered by a team led by Professor Pat McGovern, the scientific director of the Biomolecular Archaeology Project for Cuisine, Fermented Beverages, and Health at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He is also known, pleasingly, as the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, wines, and extreme beverages.
Extreme beverages.
Extreme! But it's amazing to think that we can actually figure out what the components of an ancient cocktail were. But Dr. McGovern and his team were able to do so by analyzing the molecules left behind in pottery and other containers that housed these concoctions. So I read his group's paper about this in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS, as it is affectionately known among us scientists. And they do some pretty cool stuff to try to figure out what kind of molecules were in these containers, and then to assign those molecules to the fruit or plant or wherever they came from. One technique they use is called either gas or liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, in which a sample of unknown composition, lots of different molecules all mixed up, go through a process of separation by size or by some other property. Then you can look at each molecule individually and see if you can recognize what are known as, quote, fingerprint compounds that are associated with specific natural products, particularly those that are or were available in that region. So he and his team did this, and then they did something even cooler. Along with Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware, they recreated this alcoholic beverage and made it available under the name Chateau Jehot, which was actually rated as too drinkable by the renowned beer reviewer Michael Jackson. No, not that one. different one.
Is that what he's...
And apparently it tastes like, quote, a mead, sake, wine, and cider combined. Which, honestly, all those sound really good. I can't imagine that any of those would be bad in combination. And that's a truly amazing bit of scientists engaging with the public, and that they made this esoteric aspect of archaeology feel real and important. Because one thing that has united almost all peoples the world over, throughout history, from Yahoo to the Fax Machine podcast, has been the sheer enjoyment of the shared experience of drinking alcohol, for better or worse. And it's really remarkable that in this small way, we can step into the lives of people who lived over 9,000 years ago and offer them a toast. So, cheers to that.
Cheers. So, based on this fact, I found a few other things, not necessarily invented by Noah, but that were invented in the Bible, in the text of the Bible. And I thought these were really cool. So I'll give you a few that I found. One, many times actually, it's referenced that there were lyres and harps and flutes. But at one point in the Bible, it says that King David invented all the other instruments. Just kind of in a universal kind of catch-all. And then many times after, it's quoted as saying, like, and they played harps, lutes, trumpets, which apparently David did not invent, because they get added to the list later, but they're not his. And then all the instruments David created.
Wow.
And so he was just the guy who made every instrument.
Actually, it's funny you say that because, the site where the oldest alcoholic beverage was found, they actually found also the earliest example of a playable musical instrument that has ever been found.
Wow.
And the flutes were carved from the wing bone of the red-crowned crane, with 5 to 8 holes, capable of producing the pentatonic scale that traditional Chinese music is derived from.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that really
so
interesting?
cool.
So actually at this site, they found a ton of things that were like, not just like the alcohol, but it was all kinds of things like musical instruments and, like depictions of their society and some indications of what their rituals were like. So it was a really rich discovery found like along the Yellow River in China.
That is wild.
Yeah.
One other really good story I liked of inventions in the Bible was this king, the Jewish king Uzziah, and he was credited with inventing all of the engines of war.
What about tanks?
Yeah, explicitly they're called towers with propelling objects.
Okay.
Which might be a very kind of crude tank.
Loose definition.
But it included things that threw spears, arrows, and launched catapults, or launched stones as from catapults. But if you think about it, those are the standards of warfare for thousands of years. Like, it doesn't get much better. And so it's written in this verse of the Bible that he gained much fame for doing this, because he became king when he was 16. And shortly thereafter, he used this to conquer many other peoples, including the Ammonites, the Arabs, other surrounding regions. And so it sounds to me like this guy was like a 3rd century BC Tony Stark. And he inherits great wealth, he uses it to build weapons, and he's a hero. And I make these comparisons to Tony Stark because not only everything I've already said, but also he became too proud, too cocky. He walked into the temple and he wanted to burn incense, which you are not allowed to do.
It's a no-no.
Yeah, unless you're a priest. And so, in doing so, he was smitten. By God.
He was smitten.
Yeah, well,
So-
he was
so, wait.
not like smitten with.
God is
Is that the
into it.
Latin? What is it?
Smote?
Hang on.
Smoted?
Yeah, okay. It's like, the thing where God gets really mad at you.
Okay.
Smiteth?
Oh man. Okay. So all right. So I've pulled it up off of
Oh.
thevenerablедictionary.com, and I'm seeing smote.
Okay.
Obsolete forms, so the past tense includes smit. Also smitten, so we'll count it.
Oh, hey. Yeah,
Okay,
And
okay.
apparently,
You're obsolete. That's fine.
I'm very obsolete.
and apparently smat, which I think is my favorite.
Okay,
Just like-
so if you could just say that again, but
Then
you
smat.
So he got smat by God.
Okay,
Yeah.
smack by guy. He
Yeah.
walked in the temple. He was
That's the one.
burning incense.
Then
It's a no-no.
smack.
He was
Yeah.
smack. Okay, then what happened?
That's
So he survived this smattening.
Smack. Yeah.
Yeah.
The smack.
the smatting.
And he was cursed with leprosy, but so he fell from grace, and so the people at the time for this disease to happen were like, well, what did this guy do? This was pretty serious for a king to get leprosy, and they're like, well, pride, definitely pride, and it just kind of built into that. So 2 quick things in the book of Ecclesiastes. I think these were the most kind of human of the inventions or kind of observations of inventions in the Bible. The first is just this really kind of timely thought that, it's just a quote, "Is there anything of which one might say, 'See this? Is it new? For everything is from a time before which.'" Basically saying, no, we already made everything. There are no inventions left. And then that was in the 1st chapter. In the 7th chapter, it was just this absolutely on-point observation that I thought was hilarious. And I still don't know what it means exactly, but it says, "Know that God made men upright, but they've sought many devices." And when you think about it, it's and it's vague, but it means like, isn't it strange that we stand up by God's design, but we made so many things to sit on?
That is really, really good.
And it's like, yeah, that's a
Wow.
great point.
God's like,
Yeah.
oh, come on.
It's like,
Guys,
I want you to stand
do you
for
have
this.
any idea how long I worked on this? Like 1 day.
So, speaking of somewhat biblical views on alcoholic overindulgence as a social vice, I actually looked a little bit into winemaking and consumption during Prohibition in the U.S. And one thing that immediately popped out to me is quite surprising, is that the American wine industry actually boomed during Prohibition. Notably, California growers increased their stakes of land by 700% within the first 5
Wow.
years of its enactment.
So it seems as if they were not part of this ban.
Well, so they were, but they were creative with their product. There were a few loopholes included under the Volstead Act, which established prohibition, essentially, that could be exploited to actually stay drinking during Prohibition, including prescriptions. So alcohol at the time could be prescribed for anything ranging from asthma to diabetes to snake bites. There are plenty of cases of physicians that took advantage of this fact to make a pretty penny. Also, religious sacraments were exempt. And in fact, there are records of congregation numbers skyrocketing during this period. And also, multiple people will be self-proclaiming themselves to be rabbis, so that way they can obtain wine to distribute to their followers for the Sabbath and religious practices at home.
Those people clearly have never been to church before because
You don't get
it's
enough
not
wine.
worth it.
But desperate times. Right.
That's true.
But notably...
It's like you could keep coming back around in the line.
Just circle the other line.
the
the other
Eucharist
line.
just constitutes half the Mass. Or just loops
Or you
around.
just go first and drink the whole thing.
But notably, there was also a lack of restrictions on unfermented grape juice. And this is what winemakers actually took advantage of. So essentially, a lot of vineyards, once Prohibition kicked in, preemptively shut down because they were like, well, there goes our bread and butter. We can't make wine anymore. But those that actually maintained and came to dominate the market, including very well-known brands nowadays like Beranger and Robert Mondavi, actually developed this new product called wine bricks. And essentially what they were was just grape juice that was condensed and concentrated into these dry bricks that could then be dropped into water and dissolved into grape juice.
Oh, DIY grape juice.
Yes, but the laws at the time dictated that grapes could only be grown and sold for non-alcoholic consumption under this loophole. So any grower that knowingly sold their grapes for alcoholic production would be prosecuted. But, and here's the loophole, as long as the grower specified that their product was not to be used for alcoholic production, they'd be in the clear. So basically, as I mentioned, a couple of vineyards took to making these wine blocks and put labels on them that gave careful instructions on dissolving the bricks in a gallon of water and very strict warnings that if you leave that grape juice in a cool cupboard for 21 days, it would turn into wine.
Now,
so you should not do that.
Don't you even
Wink.
think about doing this.
Yep.
It would turn to alcohol, and as we all know, that's illegal and therefore bad.
Exactly. And based on that predication, yeah, some vineyards actually flourished during Prohibition. So,
Were any of them caught?
as far as I read, none of the vineyards that participated in this were prosecuted. So I dare say they exploited this loophole quite fruitfully.
Oh.
No.
Okay, so I guess I'm up. My fact for this episode is that world-renowned Ceylon tea exists because of a blight that wiped out the Sri Lankan coffee industry. The name of that blight, scientifically, is Himalaya vistatrix, but colloquially, among planters, it was referred to as Devastating Emily.
That's your name.
That is my name. That's
So-
right. You guys focused on people, I focused on a fungus. But to give a little bit of background, coffee as a plant has actually been around and been grown in Sri Lanka for centuries, and it was likely brought over through early trade with the Arabs and Persians. But the cultivation of coffee for beverage use specifically was actually started by the Dutch East India Company in the late 18th century and then grew into a national enterprise in the 1830s. And during that period, plantations cropped up in the hills around Kandy, which is a hilly region in central Sri Lanka. And it actually continued to the extent that by 1840, the term coffee rush was applied to describe the flood of foreign investors that were coming into the region to make their fortune in coffee, much like the gold rush.
I get a coffee
in the
rush
US.
every morning.
Right?
So is
This is where
that
it
describing the development of capitalism in my morning?
Well, I don't know. How do you feel after you have your coffee?
Very, very constructive
do you
approach.
purchase more things? Regardless, by 1860, Sri Lanka, along with Indonesia and Brazil, was one of the world's major coffee producers. That is until 1869, when disaster struck in the form of Devastating Emily. It's also known as coffee leaf rust, and it's a fungal parasite, which is doubly disgusting. A fungus and a parasite, yeah.
Puts the fun in fungus.
There you go.
Plant diseases have like just universally the grossest names. Because like the other ones I looked up, they're blots, cankers, rots, rusts, and wilts, and they all just have that really heinous sound to them.
Yeah. So coffee leaf rust grows on the leaves of coffee plants, essentially sapping their nutrients and eventually killing them. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in Sri Lanka with the onset of this blight in 1869. It was nicknamed Devastating Emily because it was in fact devastating. Many planters found their crops being totally wiped out, which in their case either necessitated going bankrupt or trying to repurpose their land for another industry. And indeed, within 15 years of its onset, the coffee industry in Sri Lanka was basically gone. To contextualize this, at its peak in 1870, coffee plantations covered 275,000 acres, and by 1900, they covered 11,000. That is a 96% decrease. However, there was one guy in Sri Lanka who actually had a leg up in the wake of this disaster, and his name was James Taylor, and no, not that James Taylor.
Aw, come on.
No,
Not that
fire,
Michael
no
Jackson,
rain.
not that James Taylor.
know.
What are we doing here if
Full
we're
of
not talking about
disappointments
Michael
today.
Jackson or James Taylor? These are two of easily the most interesting people in the world.
I'm certain. I mean, by terms of record sales.
But this James Taylor was pretty interesting in his own right. He basically grew up in Scotland and opted to sail to Sri Lanka.
As
at
one
age
does.
At
Yeah.
age 17, as
As
one
of
does.
course is
In your
tradition.
angsty teenage years, it's what you do. But actually to work as the assistant to the owner of a coffee plantation near Kandy. He soon came to manage that plantation and actually spent some time in Darjeeling to learn tea cultivation practices. And then upon returning, he started growing tea along the roads and paths within that plantation, kind of honing his craft, experimenting with various strains of Chinese and Assam tea plants, and even developing new specialized machinery to dry and roll tea leaves. So this guy was very much a perfectionist in terms of introducing this craft to the region and also honing it to make the best quality tea possible.
Quality.
Hey, there you are. So by the time Devastating Emily began, well, devastating things, James Taylor actually had 20 acres of tea already growing, so coffee farmers basically flocked to him to learn his now perfected tea growing techniques. And thus the Ceylon tea industry was born. From there on, the first shipment of Ceylon tea to London occurred in 1873 and actually reached America in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And the rest is history. To this day, tea constitutes 2% of the Sri Lankan GDP, and they are the world's fourth largest producer.
It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for that fungus.
If it
and
weren't
his
for
stupid
We're
dog.
for
Devastating
Emily's
Emily.
fungus.
For Devastating Emily, precisely. Another character that I'd actually like to mention in this story is Sir Thomas Lipton, and yes, that Lipton. So he also sailed to America as a young man at the age of 14, where he spent 5 years working a bunch of very odd jobs all over the country, including on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, as an accountant in South Carolina, a door-to-door salesman in New Orleans, a farmhand in New Jersey, and then finally landing a position as a grocery assistant and later a manager in New York City. Right, so notably, during his stint in New York, he learned all sorts of savvy techniques with regards to presenting merchandise and running a store in a way that appeals to customers. And then he returned to Scotland and actually opened up first his own shop, and then over time, essentially the first chain of grocery stores in Scotland and then in Britain, and then all over using these same techniques that he learned during his stint in America. He ended up opening up to 300 stores, which was pretty impressive in its time. And actually, shortly after that, went on holiday to Australia, and he fortuitously stopped over in Sri Lanka with perfect timing with regards to the coffee blight. So when he showed up, a bunch of plantations were for sale for quite cheaply, so he bought a couple and began working with James Taylor, who I referenced a little while ago, and thus built the Lipton tea empire. However, although his legacy is most often associated with tea, it's, literally his name, he was also known for a few other things, my favorite of which is being really, really bad at sailing.
Something we share in common.
I would drown.
I would say this is the worst you can be at sailing.
So he's not the worst sailing.
He's
didn't
not
drown.
the worst. But he is remembered as being the quote-unquote most persistent challenger in the America's Cup sailing race, which actually is still occurring to this day, but had its heyday in the U.S. When it was held in New York mostly and in Rhode Island throughout the 1920s. Challengers included familiar names like the Vanderbilts and John Pierpont Morgan, and also actually Ted Turner in 1977. He won the America's Cup in that year. But basically, it involved each of these magnates trying to one-up each other by having the most high-tech yachts built and then hiring the best sailors to commandeer them in these races. So Sir Thomas Lipton competed 5 times over 30 years using yachts that were called Shamrock iterations 1 through 5 and lost every single time. But he was praised and known for his good sportsmanship as a consequence.
So he basically won the first Billionaire Spirit Award.
Essentially. And although this endeavor cost him millions of dollars, the moniker that he earned as being a lovable loser actually popularized his tea in the U.S. And indeed, after his last race, he was awarded a different cup, not the America's Cup, that was made specially for him, earning the title of the best of all losers. And actually,
So cute.
That is
Very
so
cute,
backhanded.
but it gets better. So regarding this special cup, Harold Vanderbilt, who was of the Vanderbilts and also a competitor in these races, was quoted as explaining that it was given to him basically for his own good, and that his fellow competitors saw that race as perhaps his last attempt to lift the America's Cup. But as he said, it has been our duty to shut the door in his face. So essentially a consolation prize of, you need to stop spending money on this. It's not getting you anywhere. But
It's nice that the top 1% looks out for each other. You
Yes.
you get worried about them sometimes. So reading about blights, which is something I don't often do, I found that the blight that affected the devastating Emily is not as much of a problem nowadays, and actually coffee around the world faces a huge problem in a coffee borer beetle. And it's an insect that is endemic to Africa, but has now, through global trade, migrated to South America, Hawaii, and basically every coffee-producing nation in the world, and has been associated with its own kind of blights and mass losses in coffee at those times. What's fascinating about this beetle is it actually bores into a coffee bean, lays its eggs, and then the eggs, as they hatch, the larvae crawl out, eating their way through the bean, which for any animal, including a human, like mass ratio, would be a toxic amount of caffeine. And so this beetle is like strangely adapted to living in a coffee bean and getting out of it.
And it just comes out super
It's
energized.
ready to go. It is on.
Really just ready for the day.
I don't know about you guys, but I have this image in my mind of a beetle just being like, ugh, don't talk to me before I've bored through my bean. So, since our stories have so far centered around relatively common and well-known names for lesser-known people, or fungi in my case, our quiz will focus on the lesser-known names for commonly known people, places, and things. So question number 1. Robert Galbraith, author of the crime fiction novels The Cuckoo's Calling, The Silkworm, and Career of Evil, is a pseudonym, or nom de plume if you're French or pretentious, employed by what author?
1, 2, 3. J.K. Rowling.
Okay.
Boom.
That is correct. And that was figured out not long after the release of the first of those books. Book sales rose by 4,000%. Unsurprisingly.
Didn't the lawyer who had just been like tasked with keeping it secret like accidentally snitched to a family member who then told someone who got into the news, and then he lost like a huge amount of money because it was a breach of contract?
That sounds correct. At the very least, the first part of that is true. And it was also revealed over Twitter, so it was this lawyer's wife
Oh, it was
who
just...
tweeted and was like, actually, it's J.K. Rowling.
Oh man, it's way worse than I thought.
But yeah, so wow, you guys got that pretty quickly. All right. Number 2. What city, which now has its original name, was briefly renamed as Petrograd in 1914 and then again as Leningrad in 1924?
Alright, so that's... And because of the Petrograd, I would
Yeah.
imagine it's St. Petersburg.
That is correct.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
But yes, originally named by Peter the Great in 1703. He included Berg as a shout-out to his German relatives and allies, but then in 1914, with World War I, the city was renamed to Petrograd to get rid of the German part. All right, number 3. What band, before settling on its final name, considered names such as Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins, and the Silver Beats, among others?
Ooh, the Silver Beats sounds familiar. The Silver Beats.
Oh,
is,
it's Silver Beatles. It's
that's
the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct. So they first went by the Quarrymen, which...
The Quarrymen, yeah.
For, precisely.
Yeah.
But they were also briefly the Moondogs. At that point,
Oh, wow.
John, Paul, and George were already together for that. And then the Nurk Twins, literally only for 2 nights.
Is
of
it
just
the
John
Nurk Twins?
Nurk.
The Nurk
N-E-R-K.
Twins. That's
Yes.
awesome.
Wow.
And that was just 2 nights of John and Paul playing a random set in Paul's cousin's bar to a crowd of like 3 people. And then variations of the Beatles, so including the Silver Beats, the Silver Beatles, and then finally the Beatles. Next up, what symbol was originally named an octothorpe by the workers at Bell Telephone Laboratories?
Octothorpe. Oh, wait. Okay, so a symbol would be one that appears above the numbers. So, like, basically above the number. So, like, a pound sign would be my kind of now
Ooh,
inclination.
1, 2, 3.
We're going with hashtag pound sign.
Hashtag pound sign.
Hashtag correct.
Yeah.
The name first appears in a 1973 patent for the touch-tone telephone keypad. Thorpe was thought to come from the Olympic athlete Jim Thorpe, precisely, who was very big at the time, or the Old English word for village. And actually, when you think about the pound sign or hashtag symbol, the middle square could be the village, then it would be surrounded by 8 fields. So that's the octo. Who wrote his earliest works under the pseudonym Bose, most associated with his collection of short stories and essays, Sketches by Bose? Has nothing to do with the audio company.
I was going to say,
Is it B-O-S-E?
B-O-Z.
Oh, B-O-Z. Oh. So he wrote short stories and essays, and he was ashamed of his identity.
Only for his earliest works. He was very well known.
Can you give us a time period?
Yes, the mid to late 1800s. I can give a tangential fact about him. If it would
Okay,
be
sure,
useful.
yeah.
He's known for being exceptionally verbose, and part of that was because some of his novels were published as installments, where he would be paid by the word.
Well, I'm not sure this is right, but I know Charles... I mean, a lot of people did this, but Charles Dickens
He
wrote
did the
installments.
serial stuff.
Yes, that's
Is
correct.
it? It's Charles Dickens?
It's
Okay.
Charles Dickens, yeah. But he adapted that nickname from one that was given to his brother Augustus. That nickname being Moses, and then when you pronounce Moses, I guess with a stuffy nose, it sounds like Moses, and then you have Moses.
That is lame.
But I thought
That
this
is
was
so
cute.
lame.
As an excerpt from the literary magazine Bentley's Miscellany about the reveal of his identity, who the Dickens Bose could be puzzled many a learned elf, till time unveiled the mystery, and Bose appeared as Dickens' self. And also, as a bonus question tied into our theme, who first used the phrase, "What the Dickens"?
Oh, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Yeah, really weirdly.
Also, what's in a name? Question 6. What country gets its name from Little Venice? A name given by Amerigo Vespucci upon seeing the stilt houses that dotted its coastline.
I think we both know it.
All right.
3, 2, 1.
Venezuela.
Correct.
Yes.
That moniker was given during an expedition to Lake Maracaibo in 1499. Little Venice in Italian is Veneziola, and in Spanish, Venezuela.
Wow.
So there you have it. What type of marine bird was known by 18th century British sailors as arse feet?
So what?
Arse feet?
Arse feet.
Something. So the feet are interesting?
So it has more to do with placement, if that helps.
They bring their feet up? They like stand on one foot, possibly?
It's not a flamingo.
Oh, God, that was a flamingo.
Lace. Interesting.
But I like that line of thinking, though.
Okay.
I like that line of logic.
Is it accurate, or do you like it?
I like it.
Okay.
So, I don't know if that's
Is
meaningful.
it a penguin?
Yeah. So one of the earliest written records of them being assigned this name actually comes from a book called A History of the Earth and Animated Nature. And just to kind of say a quote from that, this awkward position of the legs, which so unqualified them for living upon land, adapts them admirably for a residence in water, in that the legs placed behind the moving body, at the ass, push it forward with great velocity.
At the what, Emily?
In case you needed that clarification. And these birds, like Indian canoes, are the swiftest in the water by having their paddles in the rear. Our sailors, for this reason, give these birds the very homely but expressive name of arse feet.
Expressive.
Wow.
But,
Last question. Okay, so
pressure's on.
you guys know how much I love my Greek and Latin roots based on some sort of unpopular rounds that I've had in trivia. But
you? No.
me never. But the question: the musician Michael Peter Balzari, who plays for a band whose species name is Capsicum annuum, he goes by what nickname, which itself is an insect of the order Siphonaptera?
So
Not
he
to
goes by
unpack.
the name Siphonaptera.
Okay.
So it's a bug name.
Okay.
Siphonaptera. So probably something with optera has wings. So
Okay.
it could be a moth or a butterfly.
Aptera.
Oh,
clarify.
Aptera. Ooh.
So the band name also has a species name, which is Capsicum annuum.
Capsation. Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Oh,
I'm trying to remember the bassist name.
I'm thinking of The Edge, who's U2. I'm thinking of Slash, who is Guns N' Roses. I'm thinking of every other
I know. I
bassist.
Every other
I
name.
can't think of it. Oh my god, what? This is the worst. This is like
This is
the
that
trivia nightmare. Is that there's just this one person on your team who isn't there that night, who just knows about Red Hot Chili Peppers.
But okay, we know it's a bug. We know it's a
I
bug
know,
too.
and
Like,
the thing is, we both know who this is.
The order also, the order name also has a clue in it. So you were correct with Aptera, but also think of the first half of it as well.
siphon. It's a straw, or like it pulls up water.
Flea! It's Flea! Yes! That's it! Oh my god! That was the best feeling I've ever felt.
I just hate how well we
my
described it
God.
without thinking about it.
We were circling around that for so long.
Oh, that's great.
Oh my god,
Wow.
if you've ever needed a reason to go to your local trivia night, it is for the sheer joy of that moment.
That was excellent. That was excellent.
Oh,
Way
nicely
to,
done,
way to
guys.
talk that out.
Oh man.
That
Good
was
job,
fun
Rob.
to watch.
Way to go.
So
Good
yes,
job, team.
as you got capsicum annuum is the chili pepper, like capsaicin. There you go. And siphon aptera, siphon for a siphon. Ew. Bloodsuckers, and Aptera for not having wings. Fun fact, this guy is also the voice of Donnie from the Wild Thornberries.
Oh.
All right, well, that's all we've got for you this episode. Thanks again so much for tuning in. Be sure to check out our social media presences at Fax Machine Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and at Fax Machine Podcast on Facebook. And we'll see you next time.